a woman with a one-way ticket and nothing behind her worth returning to, a man who had quit mending things, and a marriage written down on paper by two strangers who meant nothing by it, until it turned out to be the only true thing either of them owned. Nobody in Antler Bend gave Adelaide Renfrew until spring. She came off the westbound with a carpet bag in one hand and a brass-bound cheese hoop under the other arm, and the men on the platform looked at the hoop the way you look at a thing you cannot name and have therefore decided is useless. The man who had sent for her did not come to the siding. He did not send word. The homestead she was riding toward had been sliding into the ground for 3 years, and everyone in the district knew it. But Adelaide had already lost one place in her life, and she had learned exactly what that cost, and she was not going to pay it twice. If this one finds you tonight, leave a like and put the name of your town in the comments. I'd like to see how far across this country the story travels. The sighting at Antler Bend, District of Alberta, Northwest Territories, was a plank platform, a water tower, and a signboard that had lost its second end to weather. It was the 11th of November, 1889. Adelaide Renfrew stepped down into air that felt scraped clean, the kind of cold that has no wind in it yet, and is therefore worse, because it means the wind is coming. 9 passengers got off. 8 of them were met. A boy took a woman's bags. A man in a buffalo coat embraced another man and slapped him twice on the back. A freighter loaded 4 crates onto a low wagon and drove off before the steam had finished curling off the engine. Adelaide set her bag down on the planks and stood beside it with the cheese hoop against her hip and watched the platform empty. She waited 30 minutes, then 40. The telegraph key inside the shed clicked and stopped and clicked again. A dog crossed the rail line without hurrying. She took the letter out of her coat pocket and read it again, though she knew the whole of it. There were only 3. The first had come through the matrimonial correspondence office in Toronto, and the office had described the man as sober, hard-working, land in the territories, seeks capable wife. The letters themselves had been shorter than the description. E. Hardesty had a small, cramped hand and used no more words than a bill of lading. The last one said, "I will meet the Tuesday train. I have a dark gray mare, and I am taller than most." It was 1:45 on Tuesday, and there was no mare and no man on the platform at all. Across the rutted street stood a store with a false front and a stovepipe leaning off true. She picked up her bag and crossed and pushed the door in against the cold, and the bell over it made a flat sound like something dropped. The store smelled of coal oil, cured tobacco, and dry goods. A man behind the counter looked up from a ledger. He had a narrow face and the settled, unsurprised expression of a man who has extended credit to most of the district and expects to be disappointed by roughly half of it. "Afternoon," Adelaide said. "I'm looking for the Hardesty place." The man closed the ledger over his finger. "You'd be the one," he said. "I'd be Adelaide Renfrew, Elias Trombley." He came around the counter and looked past her at the window as if a man might materialize in it. Emmett didn't come in. "No." Trombley made a sound in his throat that was neither defense nor accusation. From the back of the store, a woman came through a curtained doorway, drying her hands. She was broad-shouldered and gray at the temple, and she looked at Adelaide the way a person looks at weather. "Josephine," Trombley said. "This is Miss Renfrew." "Mrs. Renfrew," Adelaide said. "My husband's been dead 19 months. Josephine Trombley took that in without flinching. "You'll want tea," she said, "before you go anywhere." Adelaide did want tea. She drank it standing near the stove, and did not sit, because sitting is how a person becomes a guest, and she had not come out here to be anyone's guest. She asked how far. 7 miles northwest, Trombley said. "Follow the trail past the coulee. Keep the poplar bluff on your right, and when you come to a fence with the wire down in 3 places, that's his, and if I've no horse?" Trombley looked at the cheese hoop, then at her boots, then out the window, where the sky had gone the particular flat white that means snow within the day. "I've a mare named Kettle and a buckboard," he said, after a pause long enough to make it clear this was not a thing he did. "Bring them back tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Adelaide said. "Thank you." She had married at 20. She had been a farmer's wife in Oxford County for 9 years, and before that a cheesemaker's daughter, and she had stood at her father's vat from the age of 11, when she was tall enough to reach the curd knife without standing on the box. Her father died in the 2nd year of her marriage. Her husband died of typhoid in a bad April, and by June the bank had the barn, and by August it had the house, And in between, she learned that grief and arithmetic can occupy a person's mind at the same time without either one making room for the other. She was 29 years old. She had good hands, a strong back, a small notebook, and a brass-bound cheese hoop that had come out of England with her grandmother. She had $13 and no relations who could take her in without hardship. She had answered the advertisement the way you take the only road out of a valley, not because it goes somewhere you want, but because it goes. The mare Kettle had opinions about the cold and expressed them by walking at whatever speed suited her. The trail ran northwest between low hills the color of old rope. Adelaide watched the fence lines as she passed them, because fence lines tell you everything. A man who keeps his wire tight keeps his books tight. A man who lets the post lean has been losing an argument with something for a long while. By the time she reached the fence with the wire down in 3 places, it had begun to snow. Not the storm, only its scouts. Single flakes drifting sideways with all the time in the world. The house sat in the lee of a poplar bluff. It was a 1.5-story frame house, unpainted, silvered by weather, and it had been built by someone with intentions. There was a porch, and the porch had turned posts, and one of the turned posts had rotted at the base and been replaced with a squared timber that did not match. The barn was better than the house. The barn was in fact very good, which told her something about the man before she ever saw him. She was tying Kettle at the rail when he came out of the barn with blood to the elbows. Emmett Hardesty was a tall, spare man of about 40, with a beard gone iron at the jaw and a face that had been made for holding still. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the buckboard, and at the mare, and at the cheese hoop lying on the seat, and last of all at Adelaide, standing in the yard in a wool coat that had been good 6 years ago. "You'd be Mrs. Renfrew," he said. "I would. I had a heifer down since 3 this morning. Calf came backwards." He looked at his own arms as though he had just noticed them. "I couldn't leave her." Adelaide had wanted, on the ride out, to be angry. She had constructed several sentences for the purpose. Standing in the yard, watching the steam come off his forearms in the cold, she found she could not use any of them. Did she live? She lived. Calf didn't. "I'm sorry," Adelaide said, and found she meant it, and found also that this irritated her slightly. "Mr. Trombley lent me the mare and the wagon. They go back tomorrow. I'll take them in myself in the morning," Emmett said. "You'll not want to ride 7 miles twice in 1 week. I'll manage 7 miles. I don't doubt it." He wiped his arms on a piece of sacking. "But I'll take them in." He did. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the sort of small thing the district would not have noticed. He hitched Kettle before daylight the next morning, drove her the 7 miles into Antler Bend, walked home, and came in at 2 in the afternoon with snow to the knee, and Trombley's promise of the loan of a horse for a week, in exchange for a harness Emmett would repair over the winter. Nobody thanked anybody. The account was simply settled, the way accounts were settled in that country, by the doing of a thing. The inside of the house was cold in the way of a place that has held one person too long. The furniture was heavy, well made, and arranged for use. There was a stove that was doing its best. There was a shelf of books, a veterinary manual, 2 almanacs, a hymnal, and a novel with the spine broken at a place someone had returned to often. On the mantel there was a photograph in a black frame. A woman seated, a boy of perhaps 5 standing at her knee with his hand on her shoulder, both of them looking into the camera with the stiff patience of people who have been told to hold still. Adelaide looked at it. She did not ask. Emmett came in from the porch with an armload of wood and saw her looking, and neither of them said anything, and he set the wood down and built the fire up. They ate at the kitchen table, salt pork, potatoes, bread that had been baked several days ago, and was honest about it. There was not enough of it. Neither of them mentioned that. "You were married," he said at length. 9 years. He died typhoid. 2 Aprils ago." She turned her cup around on the table. "I married at 20. I'm 29 now, in case you were doing the sum." Emmett almost smiled. It went across his face and left. "I was." The farm went to the bank. There was nothing left to fight over, which is a mercy of a kind. She said this without any particular weight, because she had said it to herself often enough that the weight had gone out of it. "And you?" He looked at his plate for a while. 3 years ago," he said. "Diphtheria came through in the fall. Isabel and our boy, Thomas." He set his fork down, 8 days between them. Adelaide sat with that. Outside the window, the snow had settled into its work. "I'm not here to take her place," she said. Emmett looked up. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since the yard, and his eyes were gray and entirely without self-pity, which she had not expected. "I know that," he said. "I never asked for that. I'd have said so in the letter, if I'd known how." They were married on the Thursday, in the front room of the Methodist manse in Antler Bend, by a minister with a cold. Elias Trombley stood as one witness, and Josephine Trombley as the other. It took 9 minutes. Adelaide wore her gray traveling dress. Emmett wore a black coat that had been let out at the shoulders by someone who was not a tailor. When it was over, Josephine kissed her cheek, and Elias shook Emmett's hand and said, "Well," and they drove home in a borrowed cutter, and Emmett went out to the barn to check the heifer. It was not a wedding. Both of them knew it. Adelaide slept that night in the small room off the kitchen, and Emmett slept upstairs, and neither of them remarked on the arrangement then or for a long while after. In the morning she began her inventory. She started at the barn because the barn was where the money was, or where the money had been. 14 milk cows, mostly Shorthorn, 2 of them Ayrshire crosses. 9 of the 14 were in decent flesh, 3 were thin, 2 had feet that wanted trimming. There were 41 head of young stock and steers in the corrals, and on the winter range, which was more animal than the hay in the loft, was going to support if the winter ran long, and she said so. "I know," Emmett said. He was to say that a good deal in the first month, and she came to understand that it was not defensiveness. It was an inventory of his own, one he had been carrying alone, unspoken, for 3 years. The cream cans were what stopped her. There were 9 of them stacked by the milkhouse door, and they were clean, which said something about him, and they were idle, which said something about everything else. "You're not shipping." "Wetherall's Creamery took my cream till August," Emmett said. "He's paying 11 cents the pound of butterfat now. It costs me the better part of that to haul it in twice a week. So you're feeding milk to the pigs." "I'm feeding milk to the pigs." Adelaide stood in the milkhouse with her breath showing and looked at the 9 cans and the slate floor, and the spring that came out of the hillside behind and ran through a stone trough in the corner of the room, cold and steady and unfailing, 12 months of the year. "How cold does that stay?" Emmett frowned. "Cold. 50 degrees, maybe. Less." "All summer?" "All summer." She put her hand into the water and held it there until it hurt. That evening, she opened her notebook at the kitchen table and began to write. Emmett watched her from across the room with the expression of a man observing a foreign custom. "What is it you're doing?" "I'm writing down every problem on this place," Adelaide said without looking up. "Then I'm going to cross them off." "There's a good number of them. I expect there are." She turned a page. "It's the only thing I've ever found that helps." The list ran to 4 pages. Wire down 3 places, east line. Loft short by an estimated 6 tons. Milkhouse door swollen won't shut. Chimney needs sweeping. Account at Trombley's ask. Cream, 11 cents. Not enough. Not ever going to be enough. Below that she wrote, "Spring runs 50 degrees year-round. Slate floor. Stone trough." And below that, "Cheddar keeps. Cream doesn't. She found the rhubarb in the root cellar in the last week of November." She had gone down with a lantern to count what there was. Turnips, carrots in sand, a barrel of salt pork, 7 crocks of preserves with the wax cracked on 3 of them, and in the far corner, behind the potato bin, there was a wooden box of damp sand, and set into the sand in a neat row, the way a careful person sets things, were 9 rhubarb crowns. They had been lifted and stored. They had not been replanted. The sand had been damp 3 years, and the crowns were pale and stringy, and, when she scratched one with her thumbnail, alive. She brought one up into the kitchen and set it on the table. Emmett came in from the barn and saw it, and stood in the doorway with his hat still in his hand, and his face did something she did not have the acquaintance to read. She waited. She had already learned that with him, waiting worked and asking did not. "She lifted those the fall before," he said. "Meant to move the bed away from the eaves. Water was coming off the roof onto them." Adelaide said nothing. "I couldn't do it," Emmett said. "After. I kept the sand wet." He looked at the crown on the table for a long moment. "That's a foolish thing to keep doing for 3 years." "It isn't," Adelaide said. "They're living." He put his hat on the peg. His back was to her. "I'd like to plant them in April," she said, "away from the eaves, if that's all right." She meant the question on more than one level, and they both knew it, and she did not soften it for him. "Yes," Emmett said, to the wall. "It's all right." December went hard and quick, and there was no time in it for anything but the work. She milked. She learned the 14 cows by their tempers before she learned them by their markings. The Ayrshire cross that kicked. The old red cow that would stand for anybody, the young one that had to be talked to. She swept the chimney with a sack of stones and a rope. She patched the milkhouse door with a strip of felt and a plane and a great deal of language she did not use out loud. She wrote in her notebook and drew a line through chimney and a line through door and left wire down, 3 places for a Saturday. The Saturday came. They worked the east line from first light, Emmett stretching and stapling while Adelaide carried the wire and set the posts he cut. And by 4 o'clock the short day gave out, and they had put up 900 feet of good tight fence. Her hands bled through her mitts in 2 places. She did not mention it. Riding back to the house, she looked at the wire standing straight against the snow and felt something in her chest that was not pride, exactly, and not relief, but was in the family of both. That night, she wrote in the notebook, East Line, and drew the line through it. Cyrus Wetherall's name came into the house on the 9th of December, at the store. Adelaide had driven in for coal, oil, and salt. Josephine Trombley was at the counter, and there was a man beside her in a good beaver coat, hatless, warming his hands. A man of about 50 with a broad pink face and a way of standing that suggested he had never in his life been asked to move. Mrs. Hardesty, he said, when Josephine introduced them. He said it pleasantly. I was sorry to lose Emmett's cream this summer. He was sorry to lose the money on it, Adelaide said. Wetherall laughed. It was a good laugh, easy, entirely without malice, and it made Adelaide's neck cold. 11 cents is the market, he said. I don't set it. I only meet it. He drew on his gloves finger by finger. You tell him the door's open, and tell him if the winter runs against him, I've an interest in that quarter with the spring on it. Fair price. No pressure in it. I'd rather see a good spring in production than see a man starve on top of it. He touched his hat and went out, and the bell made its flat sound behind him. Josephine Trombley wrapped the salt without looking up. He's bought 4 places in this district in 6 years, she said. He never once raised his voice at anybody. Adelaide told Emmett that night. He listened and set his cup down, and something closed in his face like a door in a draft. He came 2 years ago, Emmett said. After. I was not fit to make a decision, and the offer was better than the land was worth. You didn't take it. No, why not? He looked at her across the table. It was the longest he had ever held her eyes. Because Isabel and I broke that quarter together, he said. And because I'd have taken his money and then had to go on living somewhere, and I couldn't think where. Adelaide got up and got her notebook and sat down again and turned it around so he could see the figures. 11 cents the pound, she said. 14 cows, and the 4 fresh in March will make 18. There's no living in it. There will never be a living in it, because the man who sets the price also owns the only road the cream can travel. Emmett looked at the page. Then I don't see the way, he said. Cream spoils, Adelaide said. It has to go to him, and it has to go to him fast, and that's the whole of his power. Cheese doesn't spoil. Cheese travels. Cheese goes to Calgary, and it goes on the CPR to wherever it likes, and it gets better while it's going. She turned the notebook back. I made cheddar with my father from the time I was 11. 10 tons a season, some years, out of a factory the size of your barn. I can make it here. There's a slate floor in that milk house, and there's a spring running 50 degrees through it. And that's a curing room, Mr. Hardesty. That's a curing room already built, and you've been keeping pigs in it. Emmett was quiet for a long time. I don't know the first thing about it, he said. You don't have to, Adelaide said. You have to know cows. You already do. She wrote to a supply house in Toronto for rennet and a curd knife and a thermometer, and the letter went out on the westbound, and the goods came back on the eastbound in 3 weeks, and cost $8.40, which was more money than the house had seen at one time since August. Emmett did not argue about the $8.40. He built her a vat. He built it out of a stock trough and sheet tin and a wooden jacket, and he built it well, because that was the thing he could do, and Adelaide understood, watching him fit the seams, that a man who has stopped repairing his own porch will still repair anything at all if you can convince him it belongs to someone else. The first make was on the 2nd of January, and it was a failure. The curd set slow, the temperature ran away from her, and she pressed out a wheel that was going to be sour and crumbling in 6 weeks, and she knew it before it was out of the hoop. She stood in the milk house with her hands in cold whey and said nothing for a long while. Emmett was in the doorway. He did not offer comfort, which she was grateful for later. What was wrong with it? He asked. The milk house is too cold to ripen and too warm to hold, and I was slow. She wiped her hands. And I've not made cheese in 3 years, and I forgot that a thing you know in your hands goes out of your hands if you don't use them. Then we'll do it again on Thursday. She looked at him. We, she said. I've a lot of milk, Emmett said, and I'm short of pigs. The second make was better. The fourth make was good. By the end of January, there were 9 wheels on the plank shelf he'd built along the north wall, wrapped in bandage cloth, turned every second day, and the milk house had begun to smell like her father's factory in Oxford County, like clean stone and sour whey, and something patient going on in the dark. January was the cold month, 40 below for 11 days without a wind, which is survivable, and then the wind, which is not. They lived by the stove and the barn lantern. Emmett brought a keg of bent staples in from the barn one night, thousands of them, pulled off the old fence, and sat at the kitchen table straightening them one by one with a hammer and a flat iron. You could buy staples, Adelaide said, on the third night. I could. She sat down across from him and picked up the hammer that lay in the middle of the table, which had been lying there in the middle of the table for 3 nights, and began straightening staples. They worked without talking. The lamp was between them. The wind found the gap under the north door and laid a thin white line of snow along the floorboards, the same line every night which she had given up sweeping. My father used to say courage is a horse, Emmett said after a long while. It'll carry you a long way and then it'll throw you. He turned a staple over. Isabel wasn't brave. I've heard people say she was, since. She wasn't. She just never once considered stopping. I don't know a word for that. Stubborn, Adelaide said. That's a poor word for it. It's the only honest one. She set a straightened staple on the pile. A brave person decides to go on. A stubborn person never lets it get as far as a decision. Emmett looked at her across the lamp. Which are you? He said. I'm a fence post, Adelaide said. I don't go anywhere and I don't come out. He laughed. It surprised them both. It was a short, rusted sound, and it stopped almost as soon as it began, and afterward he looked down at the staples with the particular embarrassment of a man who has heard his own voice make an unfamiliar noise. The Chinook came on the last day of January, and it took the temperature up 60 degrees in 8 hours and turned the snowpack to sugar, and then on the 2nd of February it went out again, and the wind came back around out of the north and brought a whiteout with it. Adelaide was in the milk house when it hit. She had gone out at 4 to turn the wheels. When she opened the door to come back, the yard was gone. There was no barn, no house, no bluff, no ground. There was only white moving horizontally at 40 miles an hour and a sound like a train that never arrived. She knew better than to walk into it. She stood in the doorway with the wheels behind her and did the arithmetic. 60 feet to the house, and if she went 9 degrees wrong, she would miss it, and past the house there was nothing at all between her and the coulee, 4 miles on. People had died 60 feet from a door in that country. Everyone knew a story. She was still standing there, 20 minutes later, cold to the bone, when the rope came out of the white. It came sliding along the ground and hit the door frame, and she picked it up, and it went taut in her hands, and she followed it, hand over hand, 60 feet, with her eyes shut against the ice. And at the end of it there was Emmett Hardesty on the back step, with the other end wrapped twice around his fist and around the porch post, and he pulled her in and shut the door and stood there, in the sudden silence, with snow packed solid into his beard and his eyebrows, breathing hard. You tied it to the post, she said, when she could speak. I tied it to the post, he agreed. And then you paid it out 60 feet with no way of knowing you'd hit the door. There's not so many things out there to hit. Adelaide sat down on the floor by the stove because her legs had stopped being interested in the matter, and Emmett brought her a blanket and did not say anything else about it. And it was 3 days before she understood that he had been standing on that step, in that wind, watching for her, since the moment the light changed. Cyrus Wetherall came out to the place on a Tuesday in the middle of February. Adelaide saw him from the kitchen window, riding up on a good bay, sitting easy in the cold the way a man sits when he has never once had to consider whether he will be warm later. She was at the door before he reached the step. He looked mildly surprised to find her there, which she suspected was the intended effect of arriving at a house at that hour. Mrs. Hardesty, Mr. Wetherall. He's in the barn. I'd sooner speak with him direct. Of course, Adelaide said, and stepped aside, and went out the back and across the yard and told Emmett, Cyrus Weatherall is in the kitchen, and Emmett hung the harness on its hook and came. She did not leave the room. She went to the stove and put the kettle on it, which gave her a reason, and neither man remarked on it. Weatherall was pleasant. That was the thing she would remember. He asked after the cattle. He asked how the winter had used them. He mentioned, in passing, that Elias Trombley's accounts were his own business, and he'd not dream of asking, but that a man knew things in a small district. Then he said, in exactly the same tone, "I'll make it plain, Emmett, because I've a poor opinion of men who don't. I'll give you $600 for the spring quarter. You've the use of the water for stock as long as you farm here, in writing, and I'll pay the survey. It's a fair figure, and there's no hurry in it. I only want you to know it's there." The spring quarter was the good land. It was the creek-fed piece, and the spring in the hillside behind the milk house came out of it, and Adelaide had spent the winter turning that spring into money. She kept her eyes on the kettle. "I'm not selling," Emmett said. "I'm not pressing." "I know you're not. You never do." Emmett's voice was level. There was something held down underneath it. "But I'm not selling any part of this place, Harlan. Cyrus, I'm not selling it." Weatherall let the slip go by, which was the most contemptuous thing he did all afternoon. He looked around the kitchen then. He looked at the stove, and the swept floor, and the wheel of cheese sitting on a board on the sideboard with a wedge cut out of it, and Adelaide's notebook lying open on the counter with its columns and its crossings out. His eyes went over all of it, taking an inventory of his own. "You've made improvements," he said. "We have," Emmett said. The word sat down in the middle of the room and stayed there. Weatherall heard it. Adelaide watched him hear it, watched the small recalculation go across that broad pink face and get put away. "Well," Weatherall said, picking up his hat, "spring's a long way off. The offer keeps." When he had gone, Emmett stood in the middle of the kitchen for a while with his hands at his sides. Then he sat down at the table, heavily like a man setting down a load he has been carrying, so long he forgot it was not part of him. "He'll come back in June," he said. "Yes, he thinks the cattle sale won't cover the account, will it?" Emmett rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "It'll be close." Adelaide sat down across from him and opened the notebook. 41 wheels by the end of April," she said. "They'll want 90 days. Trombley will take 8 or 10 for the store, and he'll pay in trade, which is no good to us. The rest has to go to Calgary." She looked up. "Do you know anyone who freights?" He did. His name was Isidore Chartrand, and he was a Métis freighter out of the Bow Country, who had been hauling in that district since before the railway came, and had strong opinions about the railway. He was a short, broad, weathered man of 60, who said almost nothing, and noticed almost everything. He came to look at the cheese in the first week of March, walked the length of the plank shelf with his hands behind his back, stopped at the 11th wheel, put his nose to it, and said, "This one is turning." Adelaide had thought so too. She had not been certain. "Can you take 40 wheels to Calgary in the last week of April?" Chartrand considered. "In April, the trail is mud to the axle. Can you take them?" "I did not say I could not take them." He looked at her with something that might in another man have been the beginning of a smile. "I said the trail is mud. You will pay for the mud." He came back a week later with a set of iron pins for the cheese press, which he had made himself, and which he did not mention and would not be thanked for. He also brought a pair of moosehide mitts, lined, worn soft, and set them on the table by Adelaide's plate, and went out to see to his horses. Emmett looked at them and said nothing. Adelaide had been wearing wool mitts through the thumb since December and had never once said a word about it in Chartrand's hearing. She looked at Emmett. "I mentioned it," Emmett said to his plate. "Calving started the 11th of March. It went well, which is to say it went the way calving goes, in the dark and the mud, with the lantern hung on a nail, and both of them past speech by the 4th night. 19 calves, 17 alive. On the 5th morning Adelaide came out of the barn with milk in a pail to start the day's make, and Emmett came across the yard fast and took the pail out of her hands and set it down in the snow. Not that one. She was too tired to be careful. It's clean milk. Smell it. She smelled it. There was nothing there, nothing she could catch, only tiredness and cold. She looked up at him. "Sweet," he said. "The old red cow. She was slow getting up this morning, and I thought it was the mud." He was already going back toward the barn. "It's milk fever. I've seen it 4 times. If I'm right, she'll be down inside the hour, and if she's down more than a day, she doesn't get up." He was right. They got her before she went flat, and they got calcium into her the way the veterinary manual said, and by evening she was on her feet and indignant. Adelaide stood in the stall with her hand on the cow's shoulder and thought about 11 pounds of curd going into a vat with the milk of a sick animal in it, and 40 wheels on a shelf, and 90 days. "You saved the make," she said. "I saved the cow," Emmett said. "You saved the make." He was coiling a rope, and he did not look up, but she saw the corner of his mouth. "I read your book," he said. "The notebook. 2 months back. I know I shouldn't have. I wanted to know what you'd written under my name." Adelaide leaned against the stallboards. "What had I written?" "Nose cattle," Emmett said. Underlined, Isidore Chartrand left for Calgary on the 24th of April with 40 wheels of cheddar in a wagon and a spare team. And he came back on the 9th of May with a bank draft and a folded piece of paper covered in his own square figures. And he laid both on the kitchen table and went out to water his horses before anybody could look at his face. The draft was for $286.50. Emmett looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and went to the shelf and took down the tin box with the accounts in it, and Adelaide watched him go through it. The store bill, the note on the mower, the taxes, the seed, and she watched him write the figures in a column in his cramped small hand, and subtract and sit back. "Clear," he said. "Say it again. We're clear." He put his hand flat on the table beside the draft, as though it might get away. "There's $91 over." Adelaide sat down. She had thought she would feel something enormous. What she felt instead was her hands, which hurt, and her back, which hurt, and a great flat calm, and underneath the calm, running like water under river ice. The fact that Cyrus Weatherall's offer would stand there in June, exactly where he had left it, unanswered, going nowhere at all. She planted the rhubarb on the 12th of April, in a bed 30 feet out from the eaves, and she did it alone, and did not tell him. He found the bed on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of May. Adelaide was in the milk-house. He came to the door with his hat in his hand and said, "Come out here a minute," and she followed him across the yard, and there in the dark-turned soil were 9 rhubarb crowns, and out of them, red and thick and blunt as thumbs, 20 or 30 shoots pushing up out of 3 years of sand and dark. Emmett crouched down beside them. He did not touch them. He stayed there for a while with his forearms on his knees. "She'd have liked that somebody used them," he said. "She'd have liked more than that," Adelaide said. She lifted them. She meant them to go on. Emmett stood. He turned around, and he looked at her the way she had never once seen him look at anything. And Adelaide understood, standing in the yard with the wind coming down off the foothills, that whatever was coming had been coming since the night in the barn with the lantern, since the rope out of the whiteout, since the staples, and that she had known it for months and had written it in no notebook anywhere. "Adelaide," he said, "I know, I've a thing to say, and I've no way to say it well, then say it badly." He looked at the rhubarb, and at the mountains, and then at her. "I don't want an arrangement," Emmett said. "I want a marriage. I want to stand up in front of people and say so, and I want them to hear it. What we did in that front room in November, that was a paper. I've nothing against the paper." He stopped. His hands opened and closed. "I want the other thing. I want it said out loud in front of anyone who cares to come." "It's been the other thing since January," Adelaide said. "Then let it be said," he said. They were married, properly married, in the way that Emmett meant, and in the way she had not known she wanted until he said it, on the 17th of May, 1890, in the yard of the Hardesty place, between the poplar bluff and the rhubarb bed. The Reverend Duncan Aird came out from Antler Bend and stood with his back to the barn. Elias Trombley and Josephine Trombley witnessed it and signed the register, Josephine in a hand like copperplate, and Elias in a hand like a rail fence. Isidore Chartrand stood at the back with his hat off, and his hands folded, and did not sing during the hymn, and afterwards said, of the whole proceeding, "Good," which from him was an oration. The Trombleys' granddaughter, who was 9 and named Kitty, carried a fistful of crocus she had picked out of the coulee that morning, and dropped half of it, and did not care. Josephine brought a cake. Chartrand brought bannock, and a bottle of something he did not identify. They ate at a table dragged into the yard, and the wind kept lifting the cloth, and Kitty kept sitting on it. Adelaide wore the gray traveling dress, because it was the dress she owned, and because she had worn it into that country with $13 in her pocket, and she had decided, some weeks before, that she would wear it out of this particular winter as well. When it was done, Emmett kissed her, and it was not smooth, and it was hesitant for perhaps half a second in the way of two adults who know exactly what they are risking and how much of it there is. And then it was not hesitant, and Kitty said, "Oh," in a carrying voice, and Elias Trombley laughed until he had to sit down. Adelaide thought about her husband then, about the other one, the one buried in Oxford County under a stone she had paid for with the sale of her mother's ring. She thought of him without grief. She thought of him with something more like gratitude, because he had helped to make the woman standing in this yard, and she did not intend to forget it, and she never did. The place was not finished. That summer the barn roof wanted shingling on the north slope, and the west line still ran through a slough where the posts would not hold, and the young Ayrshire cross came up short of milk and never did make anything of herself. In August a hailstorm took the oats. In September they made 104 wheels of cheddar, and Isidore Chartrand hauled them out in 2 loads, and Cyrus Wetherall, who was neither a fool nor a villain, but simply a man who had built his whole life on the fact that cream will not keep, said nothing about the spring quarter that year, or the next, or ever again. None of it was finished. It was never going to be finished, because land does not work that way, and neither does a life, and anybody who expects otherwise is arranging their own particular disappointment. But the wire stood. The 14 cows were 18 and then 22. The account at Trombley's was clear and stayed clear. The rhubarb came up thick against the south wall, and Adelaide made 9 quarts of it into preserves, and put them on the shelf beside the 7 old crocks with the cracked wax, which she had never thrown out. She had come off a train in November with a carpet bag and a cheese hoop, and no plan beyond the next 12 hours. She had come through the winter with her hands ruined, and her notebook full of crossings out, and a man who had walked 14 miles in the snow so that she would not have to return a borrowed horse. That was the part she thought about afterward, in the long years, when people in the district told the story back to her and made it grander than it was. Not the cheese, and not the cheque, and not Wetherall going quiet. It was the 14 miles. It was the staples on the table for 3 nights running, waiting for her to sit down. It was the mitts left beside her plate, by a man who would not admit to having brought them. It was somebody standing on a back step in a whiteout, paying out rope into the white, on the strength of nothing but the certainty that she was out there and would want a way home. Nobody writes those down. They are too small and too plain, and they happen on ordinary Tuesdays. And they are, in the end, the whole of the thing. The rhubarb would be ready in June. She was already thinking what to do with it.